Morning, this beautiful morning, and welcome to today's newspaper review for the morning. Alright, today we'll be taking you direct to the stories, the headlines we have today on this newspaper review for the morning. As we start with the first story we have here on the Daily Trust. We're going to be starting the Daily Trust and we're going to be reading out the stories that we have for you today. And the first story we have here on page 5, we have 5 children died in suspected food poisoning and others hospitalized in Taraba. 5 children died of food poisoning and others hospitalized in Taraba State. And that's on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper for the morning. Alright, on the other story we have court orders iDEA to pay daughters $435 million, and that is on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper for the morning. And we also have on page 13, we have Fintiri set to defeat as Speaker, 11 Assembly members dump PDP, and it's an interesting story that you want to read. On the big story for this morning, we on page 2 we have DSS reviews Walade. DSS releases Walade. DSS releases Walade, and that's on the big story. And on some relating stories that we have here on the Daily Trust, we have era of impunity over IGB diesel sets, and that's on page 20 of the Daily Trust newspaper for the morning. I also have on page 18 we have 2027 Kwankwaso meets Makinde in Ibadan. 2027 Kwankwaso meets Makinde in Ibadan, and that's on page 18. And now on page 7 we have gunmen kill 25 in twin attack in Adamawa. Gunmen kill 25 in twin attack in Adamawa. And that is on the Daily Trust newspaper for the morning. Alright, let's move to the next newspaper we have here. And the next newspaper is the Tribune newspaper. Let's see the stories we have on the Tribune newspaper for the morning. Alright, the first story on the Tribune newspaper making the headlines this morning is on page 2, and the story reads presidential election to hold January 6, 2027, governorship February 6. Presidential election to hold January 16, 2027, governorship February 6. As the election is to hold on January for 2027, and the governorship election is to hold on February 6, 2027. And that's on page 2, and that's a very big story that we have there. Alright, moving forward to the relating stories that we have on the Tribune newspaper for the morning. One of the stories on page 3, we have NBC moves to resolve Edo Kogi interstate boundary dispute. I'll take that again. NBC moves to resolve Edo Kogi interstate boundary dispute, and that's on page 3 of the Tribune newspaper for the morning. And on page 12 we have NEPC wants 50% post-harvest losses threatens Nigeria export drive, and that's on page 12 of the Tribune. And we also have on page 3, also in page 3, we have EFCC operative testifies virtually in UK trial of Dame Zani, and that's on page 3 of the Tribune newspaper for the morning. Now on health on the Tribune newspaper, let's see what we have on health this morning. We have new device detects infectious and tuberculosis directly in the air, science said, and that's on page 30. I'll take that again. New device now detects infectious and tuberculosis directly in the air, and that's an interesting health story that you want to read on the Tribune newspaper for the morning. And on another big story, we have ADC NNPP rejects new electoral Act. I'll say that again. ADC and NPC reject new electoral act, and that's on page 4 of the Tribune newspaper. And on the last story we have on the Tribune newspaper for the morning, on page 11, we have FCCPC establishes case of pride fixing by local airlines. I'll take that again. FCCPC establishes case of price fixing by local airlines, and that's on page 11 of the Tribune. And we also have to prop foreign carriers next. All right, let's move to the next newspaper that we have here for the morning, and that's on the Vanguard newspaper. Let's see the story we have on the Vanguard newspaper for the morning. The first story we have on the Vanguard newspaper for the morning, we have 2027 article OB, Amechi, Mark Galadima, others reject electoral law, and that's on page 5 of the Vanguard newspaper for the morning. On the big story on the Vanguard, we have INEC moves 2027 poll to January 16. INEC moves 2027 polls to January 16, and that's on page 14 of the Vanguard newspaper. An interesting story you want to read there. Alright, we don't have much story on the Vanguard newspaper for the morning, and we have some message of appreciation from Her Excellency Senator Oluremi Tinubu, and that's another one you want to read on the Vanguard for the morning. Moving forward to the next newspaper, we have here the Telegram newspaper. Let's see the stories we have on the Telegram newspaper for the morning. Alright, on the Telegram newspaper, new Telegram newspaper for the morning. On the big story, we have INEC alters elections timetable, fixes presidential poll for January 16, 2027. And that story you read on page 4, page 5, and page 7 of the new Telegram newspaper for the morning. Alright, and on the relating stories we have here, we have Education Minister seeks more funding in 2026. Education Minister seeks more funding in 2026 this year, and that story is on page 7, an interesting one you want to read. And we also have United moves to stop United Nigerian US launch politics, and that's on page 2 of the new Telegram newspaper for the morning. Alright, let's move forward to other relating stories we have on the new Telegram. We have Dangote petitions ICPC dance in making starting discovery investigation, and that's on page 3 of the new Telegram. And we also have on the new Telegram, we have at New Telegraph, we have cause to celebrate, Aminu says, and that story you see on page 2 and page 3 of the new Telegram newspaper for the morning. All right, let's move forward to the next newspaper that we have here. We have brief stories, interesting ones that you would love to read. All right, on the Punch newspaper for the morning, let's see the stories we have on the Punch newspaper for the morning. On the headlines on the Punch newspaper, we have INEC fixes January 16 for 2027 presidential poll, and that's on page 7 of the Punch newspaper for the morning. As you can see, the story of our INEC fixing January 16 for 2027 election is actually making the headlines. Alright, on other stories, we have bandits kill 29, abduct many in fresh attack, and that's also in page 7. And we also have in page 20, we have Senate panel orders prop after inspecting Bond Lagos Airport terminal, and that's another interesting story you want to read on the Punch on page 20 of the Punch newspaper for the morning. The big story we have on the Punch this morning, we have Electoral Act. Senate rejects fresh amendments as Article Obi Amechi push back. And that's a big story on the Punch newspaper. And that story is on page 2 of the Punch that you would love to read. Let's move forward to page 20. We have FCCPC props fare fixing by local airlines. and that's on page 20. And on page 8, we have over 200 men wearing AK-47s storm Yawata police witnesses. And that's on page 8 of the Punch newspaper for the morning. It's an interesting story there on the Punch newspaper. Let's take you to the Guardian newspaper. That's the last newspaper we have for you this morning on the iDEA TV newspaper review. Now let's see the stories we have on the Guardian newspaper for the morning. Now on the Guardian newspaper, the first story we see here on page 3, we have federal government insists on state police awaits legislative backing. Federal government insists on state police awaits legislative backing, and that's on page 3 of the Guardian. And we also have Senate fault zero capital demand accountability as minister defends fiscal reforms, and that's on page 3 of the Guardian. I'll take that again. Senate faults zero capital demands accountability as ministers defend fiscal reforms. And that's an interesting story you want to read on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. I also have on page 2, we have reports terrorist attack on Nigeria, Benin, Niger borders rose by 262% in 2025. I'll take that again. Report said terrorist attack on Nigeria, Benin, Niger borders rose by 262% in 2025. And that is on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper for the morning. On the big story we have here on the Guardian, we have INEC ignores Electoral Act, protect shift 2027 election for Ramadan. I'll say that again. INEC ignores Electoral Act, protect shift 2027 election for Ramadan, and that's on page 6 of the Guardian. Alright, on the relating stories we have here, we have over 100 terrorists storm Benue village, killed 150, witness tells court. And that's a sad one there. We have it on page 29. You'll love to read the stories and know what actually went down. And on page 7, we have 2027 polls, Yoruba Runo withdraws support for APC, backs ADC. And it's an interesting political story that you want to read on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper for the morning. Moving forward on the relating stories we have commission documents 700,000 out of school children, and that's on page 7 of the Guardian. I also have federal government depends credit corp targets wider coverage and disbursement, and that's on page 5 of the Guardian newspaper. And on page 29 we have Bauchi governor says 10,000 well-armed bandits are attacking communities. 10,000 well-armed bandits attacking communities, and that's on page 29 of the Guardian newspaper. And on the last story we have on the Guardian newspaper for the morning, we have Constitution Amendment delay fuels anxiety ahead of 2027 elections. I'll take that again. Constitution Amendment delay fuels anxiety ahead of 2027 elections. That is another story read on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper for the morning. Alright, that's all the stories we have for you on the iDEA TV newspaper review for the morning. The brief stories we have for you on the iDEA TV newspaper review. Do well to follow us on all our social media platforms. At iDEA Television will bring you more newspaper reviews, more explanations, and more details. Just in case you want to add to it, do well to follow us, send us your comments, and all that on iDEA TV. My name is Mary O. Jimajo, and that is thank you for watching.